April the 2nd, 1945, Okinawa. An 18-year-old Navy medic kneels in an open field, bullets carving the air around him. In one hand, a plasma bottle, keeping a dying Marine officer alive. In the other, nothing. Then the Japanese counterattack begins. Soldiers charging directly at him. A grenade explodes. Shrapnel tears into his face, destroying his eye. He's blinded, bleeding, alone. His patient can't move. He can't run. So he does something that defies every human instinct for survival. He picks up his patient's rifle, and with one hand holding plasma high, the other firing, he fights off an entire assault wave. 6 enemy soldiers fall. His patient lives. This is the true story of Robert E. Bush. And the moment that proved courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about what you refuse to abandon when death comes for you. The landing craft hit Okinawa's shore on April 1st, 1945, April Fool's Day, and the joke was on everyone who thought they understood war. Hospital apprentice first class Robert Eugene Bush, serial number unknown to history, but burned into Navy records, felt the ramp drop. He was 18 years old, 6 months out of hospital corps school in San Diego, and he carried 40 pounds of medical supplies instead of ammunition. The Marines around him, boys who looked like men, men who looked like ghosts, had told him what to expect. They'd fought across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, island names that sounded like poetry and felt like slaughterhouses. But Okinawa was different. The island stretched 60 miles long and 18 miles wide, a dragon spine of ridges and caves just 350 miles from mainland Japan. Intelligence estimated 100,000 Japanese defenders. They were wrong by half. There were closer to 120,000, dug into positions that had taken months to fortify. The Japanese had a new strategy here. No banzai charges, no wasteful glory. Just patience, caves, and a willingness to die slowly while killing as many Americans as possible. The Americans called it Operation Iceberg. The Japanese called it Tetsu no Ame, the Rain of Steel. Later, both sides would simply call it Hell. Bush's boots hit the volcanic sand. He expected artillery. Instead, silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that feels heavier than sound. Behind him, waves delivered an invasion force of 180,000 American troops, 4 Army divisions, 2 Marine divisions, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Ships stretched to the horizon, more steel than ocean. Bush had never seen so many ships. Nobody had. This was the entire American war machine, focused on 466 square miles of coral and volcanic rock. The first day, they advanced inland almost unopposed. The second day, the same. Marines joked nervously. Where were the Japanese? What kind of trap was this? Bush didn't joke. He'd learned in training that silence in war meant someone was making a terrible decision, and you wouldn't know if it was your side or theirs until people started dying. He checked his supplies. Plasma bottles, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, bandages, tourniquets. Everything organized in his medical pouch so he could find it by touch in the dark, or in smoke, or while being shot at. He was attached to a Marine rifle company, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. 23 men he was responsible for keeping alive. He'd memorized their names on the transport ship: Johnson, Rodriguez, Smith, Williams, Kowalski, boys from Ohio and California and Texas and New York. One kid, barely 17, had lied about his age to enlist. Bush, at 18, wasn't much older. The company commander was a first lieutenant career officer, maybe 26 years old, but looked 40. War did that. The lieutenant had survived Peleliu, which gave him a haunted quality. Not fear exactly, but a permanent awareness that death was always closer than you thought. Bush, the lieutenant told him on the 3rd day, on this island, you're going to see things that'll make you question whether human beings are even the same species. Japanese don't surrender here. We don't take prisoners. Everything's close. Everything's ugly. Your job isn't to think about it. Your job is to keep Marines alive long enough to get them off this rock. Bush nodded. What else could he do? By April 2nd, the deception was over. The Japanese revealed their strategy. They'd let the Americans land, let them push inland, stretch their supply lines. Then they attacked. Not from the beaches, from the interior. From a defensive line called the Makinado Line, anchored on ancient Okinawan castles turned into fortresses, caves turned into bunkers, every ridge a killing field. The casualties started, first a trickle, then a flood. Bush worked 16-hour days, then 20-hour days. Then time stopped meaning anything. There was wounded and not wounded, living and not living. The categories were always shifting. He learned things they don't teach in hospital corps school. A man can survive without most of his intestines if you work fast enough. Morphine doesn't always stop screaming. Sometimes the kindest thing is to lie about how bad it is. The smell of burnt flesh is sweet, almost like cooking meat, and you'll hate yourself for noticing. You can't save everyone, but you have to try, because the moment you stop trying is the moment you stop being human. The Marines called him Doc. All Navy medics were Doc, regardless of actual medical training. It was a term of respect, of desperate hope. Doc could fix you. Doc would come when you called. Doc would run into fire when everyone else was running out. Bush hadn't expected the responsibility to feel like love, because that's what it was, he realized. Not romantic love, not even familial love, but something fiercer and more immediate. These men, these boys, trusted him absolutely. When they were hit, their first word was usually corpsman. Sometimes it was Mom, but more often, Doc, Doc, I'm hit. And he would come. On Okinawa, the distances were short. 100 yards could take 3 days to cross. The Japanese had perfected reverse slope defense. They'd wait until Marines crested a ridge, then obliterate them from positions on the opposite slope. Artillery was useless. You couldn't see what you were shooting at. Air support was limited. The positions were too close, too interlocked. Everything came down to men crawling through mud and coral, throwing grenades into cave mouths, shooting at muzzle flashes in the dark. Bush learned to navigate by sound. The crack of a rifle versus the chatter of a machine gun. The whistle of incoming mortars versus the crump of outgoing artillery. The different screams. Hit in the leg, high-pitched, angry. Hit in the gut, low, desperate. Hit in the chest, gurgling, wet, usually quiet because the lungs are filling with blood. He learned to run low, to use terrain, to move when the firing paused because everyone was reloading. He learned that being a medic didn't make you safe. Japanese snipers targeted medics specifically. The red cross on his helmet was a bullseye. Some corpsmen removed their crosses. Bush didn't. Let them shoot at him. Every bullet aimed at him was a bullet not aimed at a Marine. Besides, the wounded needed to see that cross, needed to know help was coming. By late March, the 1st Marine Division had been fighting continuously for 2 weeks. Everyone was exhausted, not regular tired, existentially tired, tired in their bones, their souls. They slept in foxholes filling with rain. They ate cold rations. They watched friends disappear, not even killed, just erased by artillery, nothing left to bury. The Japanese were equally desperate, but they had the advantage of fighting from prepared positions, of knowing they would die here, of having made peace with death. The Americans were fighting to survive, to go home. That made them vulnerable in ways the Japanese were not. Bush's lieutenant took a sniper round through the shoulder on March 28th. Bush pulled him back under fire, packed the wound, called for stretcher bearers. The lieutenant gripped his wrist with his good hand. "Don't you dare die on this island, Bush. That's an order." Bush tried to smile. "Yes, sir." But orders didn't matter much anymore. Death came randomly on Okinawa. The best Marine could step on a mine. The most careful sniper could catch a lucky mortar round. There was no pattern, no justice, no meaning, just chaos wrapped in cordite smoke. The day started the way every day started, gray, wet, already exhausted. The company was advancing, if you could call it that, toward a Japanese position near the town of Awacha, on the western side of the island. Intelligence, always wrong, always confident, said the position was lightly defended. Intelligence had not mentioned the network of caves, the interlocking fields of fire, the fact that lightly defended on Okinawa meant only 200 Japanese soldiers willing to die to kill you. The new lieutenant, the original was still recovering, was younger, less experienced. He wanted to prove himself. That made him aggressive. That made him dangerous. They advanced across an open field, maybe 150 yards wide. Sugarcane stubble and volcanic rock. No cover. The kind of terrain that makes infantrymen's stomachs clench. Halfway across, the Japanese opened fire. It wasn't coordinated fire. It was eruption. Machine guns from 3 positions, rifles from dozens more, mortars walking across the field. Men fell. Some scrambled back. Some froze. Some crawled forward. Marine training overriding survival instinct. When ambushed, assault through the ambush. Bush ran forward. He didn't think about it. There was no decision, no weighing of options. He heard Corpsman, and his legs moved. That was the deal. That was the job. The lieutenant was down, 40 yards ahead, alone in the open. Leg wound, maybe arterial. Bush could see the blood pooling, too much blood. The kind of blood that means minutes, not hours. He sprinted. The air seemed solid with bullets. He felt them pass, not heard, felt the pressure wave of near misses. Something tugged his sleeve. Something else kicked up rock beside his boot. The statistical improbability of not being hit felt like blasphemy, like he was stealing luck from the universe and would have to pay it back later. He reached the lieutenant. Thigh wound, just above the knee. Arterial, but not severed, thank God. The lieutenant's face was white, lips blue. Shock setting in, fast. "Doc," the lieutenant whispered. "Doc, I can't—" "Shut up, sir. Save your breath." Bush worked. Tourniquet first, high and tight. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. He needed plasma, needed to get fluids back into the lieutenant before his blood pressure dropped too far. But plasma took time. You had to set up the bottle, the line, find a vein, start the drip. And you couldn't move the patient while the plasma was running. You had to stay, exposed, vulnerable. The lieutenant had a carbine, an M1 carbine the shorter rifle officers carried. It lay beside him in the mud, fully loaded, 15 rounds. Bush set up the plasma. His hands were steady. This was the mystery of combat. Your conscious mind was screaming, but your hands knew what to do. Muscle memory, training, the body understanding what the mind couldn't accept. He held the plasma bottle high. It had to be elevated above the patient for gravity to work, and watched the clear liquid begin its journey into the lieutenant's vein, drop by drop, life by drop. Around them, the firefight continued. The Marines were falling back, using dead ground, getting organized for a proper assault. Standard tactics. Leave the dead. Evacuate the wounded who could be moved. Come back for the rest later. But the lieutenant couldn't be moved. Not yet. Not until enough plasma had restored his blood volume. Moving him now would kill him as surely as a bullet. So they waited. Bush and the lieutenant alone in the middle of a field that had become a shooting gallery. That's when Bush heard the whistles. Japanese officers used whistles to coordinate attacks. High, shrill, inhuman sounds. When you heard whistles on Okinawa, it meant someone had decided today was a good day to die and take you with them. Bush looked up. They came from the left flank, from a position the Marines had thought was cleared. Maybe 30 soldiers, maybe more. Not a banzai charge. Those had stopped by 1945. This was tactical, controlled, designed to exploit the chaos and push the Marines back, retake the field. They were 70 yards away, then 60, then 50. Bush did math in his head. Plasma bag half empty, maybe 2 more minutes needed. Marines falling back too far to provide covering fire. Him and the lieutenant completely exposed, no cover within 20 yards. Options. Leave the lieutenant, run, live, stay, die together, or... The lieutenant's carbine was right there. Bush had fired rifles in basic training, Navy basic, which meant a few hours on a range, plinking at targets. He wasn't a marksman. He was a medic. But the carbine was semi-automatic, relatively light and very much loaded. He picked it up with his right hand. His left hand kept holding the plasma bottle high above his head, the line running down to the lieutenant's arm. The Japanese were 40 yards away now. He could see their faces. They looked young, determined, already dead. Bush fired. The carbine kicked. He had no time to aim properly, no time to sight, no time for anything except point and squeeze. The first shot went wide. The second hit something. A man stumbled. The third, fourth, fifth. Then the grenade. Someone, he never saw who, threw a Type 97 hand grenade, the kind the Japanese called knee mortars because they'd fire them from curved knee braces. But this one was thrown. It landed 3 feet from Bush's position. He saw it. Had time to think. I should move. Didn't move. Couldn't move. The lieutenant was connected to him by a thin plastic tube filled with life. Moving meant dropping the plasma, meant disconnecting the line, meant the lieutenant died. The grenade exploded. Shrapnel is strange. It's not like bullets, which punch through. Shrapnel tumbles, tears, fragments. It carries pieces of whatever it hit first, metal, rock, dirt. It moves at supersonic speeds, but feels slow, inevitable, like being hit by frozen time. Bush felt his face rearrange. His right eye, the one he'd been using to aim, simply stopped working. Not pain, not yet, just absence. His vision cut in half, depth perception gone, the world flattening into a single plane. Blood poured down his face, hot and sticky, filling his mouth with copper taste. His left hand, by instinct, by some deep mammalian survival response, kept holding the plasma bottle high. His right hand, by training, by muscle memory that bypassed the parts of his brain that were screaming, kept firing the carbine. He couldn't see properly anymore. One eye was gone, destroyed, filling with blood. The other eye was swimming with shock, with tears, with the body's desperate attempt to process trauma. But he could see shapes, movement, the enemy closing. He fired at the shapes. The carbine held 15 rounds. He'd fired 5 before the grenade. That left 10. He fired them all. Reloaded. He'd grabbed the lieutenant's spare magazines when he first arrived, some instinct telling him to gather resources. Fired again. The carbine's simple blowback mechanism meant it was nearly foolproof. Point, shoot, the gun does the rest. Men fell. He didn't count, didn't aim, just fired at movement, at the shapes that meant death was getting closer. His left arm was extended above his head, trembling with effort. Plasma bottles aren't heavy, maybe a pound, but hold anything above your head for minutes while being shot at, while bleeding from your face, while your body is flooding with adrenaline and shock, and a pound becomes 10 pounds becomes impossible. He didn't lower it. The lieutenant, barely conscious, saw what was happening. Later, decades later, he would try to describe it, would fail, would cry trying. Because how do you explain watching an 18-year-old kid, half blind, face destroyed, holding plasma in one hand and a rifle in the other, killing people to save you? How do you explain the simultaneous contradiction of healing and killing, the two hands of humanity, the terrible necessity of violence in service of love? The Japanese reached 20 yards. Bush could hear them now, not just see them. Boots on volcanic rock. Shouted commands in Japanese. The metallic click of rifles being cycled. He kept firing. Later, official reports would say Bush killed 6 enemy soldiers in this action. But reports are written by people who weren't there, who need clean numbers for clean paperwork. The truth was messier. Some men he hit directly. Some stumbled and were hit by other Marines who had finally gotten organized, who were laying down covering fire, who had seen what Bush was doing and were fighting to reach him. Some of the Japanese broke off, the assault losing momentum, the price becoming too high. But Bush didn't know that. He just kept firing until the carbine clicked empty, until there were no more magazines, until his right arm was shaking too hard to aim, until the shape stopped getting closer. The plasma bag was empty. He'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, he'd kept the line open, kept the fluid flowing, kept the lieutenant alive for the critical minutes needed. The officer's blood pressure had stabilized. His color was better. He would live. Bush set down the carbine. His right hand was cramping, locked into the shape of gripping. His left arm collapsed, nerveless, unable to hold itself up anymore. The plasma bottle fell into the mud. He looked at the lieutenant, tried to say something. Couldn't. His mouth wasn't working right. The shrapnel had torn through his cheek, his jaw. Words came out as sounds, meaning without language. The lieutenant understood anyway. "You're going to be okay, Doc. You're going to be okay." Lies. Kind lies. The kind corpsmen told wounded Marines. The kind the lieutenant was now returning. Other Marines reached them. Hands grabbed Bush. Gentle, so gentle. Someone was crying. Someone was cursing. Someone was calling for a stretcher, for another medic, for God himself to come down and witness what they'd just seen. Bush tried to stand. His legs didn't work. Shock, finally breaking through, the body's payment for borrowed time. He collapsed, was caught, was lowered back down. His vision was narrowing, darkening. The single eye he had left was closing, not from damage, but from the brain's mercy, shutting down before it had to process more. He heard voices, distant and echoing, felt hands working on him, plasma for the corpsman now, tourniquets, pressure bandages. Felt himself being lifted, carried, moved away from the field that had tried so hard to keep him. His last conscious thought was professional. Did I pack the lieutenant's wound properly? Did I remember the sulfa powder? Is the tourniquet too tight? Even dying, a corpsman worried about his patient. Robert Eugene Bush woke up on a hospital ship 3 days later. The USS Solace, a Navy hospital ship marked with huge red crosses floating in the waters off Okinawa. Clean sheets, morphine. Nurses who looked impossibly calm, impossibly clean, impossibly alive. His face was bandaged. His right eye was gone. Not damaged, not injured. Gone. The shrapnel had destroyed it completely. His left eye was intact, but wouldn't focus properly yet. Everything was blurry, dreamlike. A doctor came by. Navy commander, gray-haired, professional. "Son, you're very lucky to be alive." Bush wanted to laugh. Couldn't. His jaw was wired shut. They'd reconstructed his cheek using tissue from his shoulder. It would scar. He would never look the same. The doctor seemed to read his thoughts. "The physical stuff will heal, most of it. You'll have scars. You'll wear an eye patch. But you'll be functional. The psychological stuff—" He paused. "That's harder. What you did, what you saw, what you experienced, that stays with you. Talk to the chaplain, talk to the psychiatrists. Don't keep it inside." Bush couldn't respond, but he nodded slightly, careful not to disturb the bandages. The lieutenant visited 2 weeks later, limping but alive. He pulled a chair close to Bush's bed, sat heavily. For a long moment neither spoke. "I recommended you for the Medal of Honor," the lieutenant finally said. "I don't know if it'll go through. The paperwork is complicated, but you deserve it. You deserve every medal we have." Bush shook his head, carefully, slightly. He didn't feel heroic. He felt tired. He felt old. He felt like he'd learned something terrible about himself, that he was capable of killing, that his hands could deal death as easily as they dealt life, that the distance between medic and Marine was thinner than he'd thought. "Why did you do it?" the lieutenant asked, voice breaking. "You could have run. I would have understood. Hell, I would have ordered you to run if I'd been able to speak. Why did you stay?" Bush tried to answer. The words came out garbled through his wired jaw. But the lieutenant understood. "Because you needed plasma." Such a simple answer. Such a terrible answer. Because in that answer was the whole truth of war, the whole contradiction. Sometimes saving a life requires taking lives. Sometimes healing means hurting. Sometimes love means violence. The lieutenant cried. Bush, who couldn't cry, the tear ducts in his destroyed eye were damaged, the other eye was too traumatized, watched him cry and felt nothing. Not numbness exactly, just distance. like he was watching from very far away. The Battle of Okinawa continued without him. It would rage for another 2 months. By the end, 12,000 Americans would be dead, 38,000 wounded. Japanese casualties would exceed 100,000 soldiers, plus somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. The numbers were never settled, never could be. The island would be secured on June 22, 1945. Bush would miss all of it. He was shipped back to the States in May to Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland, California. More surgeries, more therapy. More men in beds beside him, broken in body or mind, or both. The Medal of Honor came through in October 1945. The war was over by then. The atomic bombs had fallen. Japan had surrendered. Okinawa had been the last great battle, the preview of what invading mainland Japan would have cost, the demonstration that convinced Truman to use the bombs. Bush's sacrifice, the lieutenant's survival, the whole bloody campaign, it had all been for this, to make invasion unnecessary. President Truman presented the medal personally at the White House. Bush, 19 years old now, wore his dress blues and an eye patch. Truman hung the sky blue ribbon around his neck, shook his hand, called him a hero. Bush didn't feel like a hero. Heroes were supposed to feel different afterward, transformed, elevated. He just felt like someone who'd survived when others hadn't, who'd made a choice in a moment when choice seemed impossible, who'd discovered that human beings contain multitudes, killer and healer, coward and brave, all at once, all the time. Robert Bush lived until 2005, 60 more years after Okinawa. He married, had children, worked as a printer in Washington State. He attended veterans' reunions, gave occasional interviews, spoke to high school students about war. He never spoke easily about April 2, 1945. When pressed, he would describe it factually, the field, the plasma, the attack, the grenade. But facts weren't the truth. The truth was in what he couldn't articulate, the moment when his mind split into two voices, one screaming at him to run, the other whispering that the lieutenant needed 2 more minutes of plasma, and the whisper had been louder than the scream. The truth was in his dreams, which never stopped, which replayed that day in variations. Sometimes he ran, and the lieutenant died. Sometimes he stayed, and they both died. Sometimes the grenade never exploded, and he got to keep both eyes. Sometimes he arrived at the field too late, and the lieutenant was already gone. The truth was in his hands, which never felt clean again, which had held plasma and carbine, which had given life and taken it, which represented the essential contradiction of being human, that we are capable of infinite compassion and infinite cruelty, sometimes simultaneously. He was asked once, late in life, what he wanted people to understand about that day. "I was terrified," he said, "the whole time. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide. I wanted to be anywhere else. But the lieutenant needed plasma, and I had plasma, and that was the whole job right there. Everything else was just noise." Then he paused, looked at his hands. Old hands now, liver-spotted, trembling slightly from age and memory. We think courage means not being afraid. That's wrong. Courage is being terrified and doing it anyway. Not because you're special, but because someone needs you to. The lieutenant needed me, so I stayed. Anyone would have done the same. But they wouldn't have, couldn't have. That's why the medal existed, why the story survived, why we're still talking about it 80 years later. Because most humans, when faced with that choice, would have run, should have run. Running was rational, sensible, aligned with every survival instinct evolution had given us. Bush didn't run. In that field on Okinawa for those critical minutes, he embodied something we rarely see, the complete sublimation of self-preservation to duty, the absolute refusal to abandon a responsibility, the willingness to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously, that killing is wrong and that sometimes killing is necessary to prevent greater wrongs. His left hand held life, his right hand dealt death. Both hands belong to the same person, the same scared 18-year-old who joined the Navy to escape poverty in Washington state, who'd chosen hospital corps because he didn't want to kill, who'd learned on Okinawa that sometimes healing requires hurting, that sometimes saving requires sacrifice, that sometimes the only way through horror is straight ahead, refusing to let go of what you're holding, even when letting go means living. The field near Awacha exists still. Modern Okinawa has grown around it, but the space remains undeveloped, quiet. Local Japanese maintain a small memorial there, not to one side or the other, but to all the dead, all the suffering, all the waste. Sometimes veterans visit, fewer each year, as age and death thin their ranks. They stand in that field and try to reconcile the peaceful present with the violent past. Try to explain to grandchildren what happened here, why it mattered, what it cost. The field doesn't answer. It just exists, patient and neutral, growing grass where blood once pooled, sprouting flowers where men once died. It has forgotten the battle. Only humans remember, and soon there will be no humans left who were there, who saw, who know the difference between the story and the truth. But the story survives. Robert Bush's two hands holding plasma and carbine, saving and killing, embodying the terrible complexity of being human in a world that sometimes demands impossible choices. We tell the story because we need to. Because it reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. Because it shows us that courage isn't absence of fear, but action despite it. Because it demonstrates that sometimes the most heroic act is simply refusing to abandon your post, refusing to let go, refusing to choose between compassion and survival when both are necessary. April 2nd, 1945, Okinawa. An 18-year-old medic held death at bay with two hands. One hand healed, one hand hurt. Both hands were necessary. Both hands were human. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what we owe him to remember.